Hi there everyone, it's Kyle coming to you again with another video lecture. This time around we have moved past the Renaissance and we're on to one of my favorite periods, the Baroque Era. Just a quick review, last week we learned about the Renaissance period, which lasted roughly from 1450 to 1600. We learned about how Renaissance means rebirth and how the Renaissance was a sort of rebirth of art and culture after the difficult period that preceded it. The European Renaissance was characterized by richer textures in instrumentation and more complex, evolving forms of polyphony. In China, we learned about the Ming Dynasty, which brought forth a consolidation of great power, followed by an eventual isolation from the rest of the world. And musically, during this era, we saw the development of musical theater in particular. In Latin America, we learned about the Spanish and the Portuguese and how they brought colonialism and European music to what they thought of as the New World. As these musical traditions mixed with the native languages and cultures, we see development of new hybridized dances and sacred music. I do want to give a quick heads up. Basically, at least from my understanding, the Ming Dynasty lasts through the period that we'll be talking about today, and as far as like the year ranges, and the colonial period that we discussed last time in Latin America also extends through this. So this week is going to be highly Eurocentric. I do not want to give the impression that there was nothing else going on in the world, because of course that there was. However, you've probably noticed that the periods in as far as like year ranges are getting smaller. So we're no longer having these 1,000 year periods. Now we're having like 150 year periods. And so we're going to focus on what was going on in Europe and kind of like the dynamic situation that was happening there. So the Baroque era, we mentioned 150 years. The Baroque era represents many firsts in music. First, the term Baroque is Portuguese, and it means irregular shape or irregular pearls. And this period was actually named after its existence. It was named by future composers. So no one at the time called it the Baroque era. It was thought of as Baroque when people looked back and kind of tried to categorize it or find a term that would encompass what happened during this range of years. Secondly, it's very important. This era has come to represent the first period of our concert music. So if you go out to see an orchestra, you rarely hear music from the Renaissance, but starting in the Baroque era, we actually still play a lot of this music in classical orchestras. We still teach it in schools, and so you're very likely to encounter this music throughout the span of most people's normal lives. Whereas Renaissance music is a bit more rare to see performed. Baroque music is still being performed all over the place. We can characterize Baroque music by composers focused highly on the highest and lowest notes, leaving players of the middle parts to improvise. This is something called, and ties into something called figured bass, which we don't get into in this presentation. Your book leaves it out. It is very important, but I thought maybe it was just a little more granular than we needed to go with our lecture. The Baroque era starts to focus on these long, flowing melodic lines, often using ornamentation. A lot of people say, and I don't know if this is 100% true, but maybe it's an easy way to remember, is that a lot of Baroque music is very interesting to listen to, but it's not necessarily stuff that you're going to leave the concert hall kind of tapping your foot to or singing. It's not as singable as music that comes later. And so the Baroque is known for having kind of these cascading phrases, music that kind of sounds like like this kind of really quick moving cascading melodic lines. So it's a little bit less singable than what comes later. Composers began to embrace the idea of contrast, so loud and soft, or solos and ensembles. This has a lot to do with kind of the way we started to build instruments and we started to think about instruments. But I think it's really interesting, we start to pay attention to dynamics. We didn't so much in the eras that have preceded this. Really, composers pre-Baroque era, if they wanted something louder, they would just add more voices. And the number of voices would mean that it sounded louder. Whereas now, the composer might ask the player to play softly or play loudly. And so that's kind of a new thing. And then lastly, contrapuntal texture with two or more melodic lines layered over each other. We're going to learn about this with fugues, but it's, again, a further evolution of counterpoint. I've always thought that it's very handy when thinking about the Baroque era to think about architecture. So here I've got two kind of what we would classify as Baroque style cathedrals that you can look at. And I just want to point out how Baroque architecture is very dramatic. It's very grand. It has all these tiny little details running all over the place. This isn't what I would describe as like necessarily sleek or modern or minimalist in any ways, right? This is very ornate. There are bright colors. There's lots of gold. Every inch of the building, it has some kind of design going on. People might call it gaudy, you know. I think in general, many of our tastes today with like modern architecture are sleek and more reserved and not as highly decorated and as elaborate as Baroque architecture is. But I think, just as I mentioned that maybe Baroque composers used a lot of notes and would have these long, very ornamented vocal lines or melodic lines, we can see that the architecture that we would describe as Baroque is also incredibly ornate. There's lots of ornamentation visually here, and so I can't help but think about Baroque architecture when I'm thinking about Baroque music. I've listed some other interesting events that were happening during the Baroque era, just a couple of them. Galileo saw the moons of Jupiter for the first time during this period. Don Quixote was written during this time, and the Taj Mahal was also finished during this time. Again, these are just a few things. Of course, things were happening in America during this time, so Benjamin Franklin published Poor Richard's Almanac during this time. But I think it might be interesting to kind of just see what else was going on in the world so you can kind of ground this and get a better feel for like what the culture was like. One of my favorite teachers I ever had in school told me the great thing about history and the important thing to remember is that it all happened at the same time. And so we can't think that these things are happening in a bubble, right? This music is a consequence of the culture that was happening around it and that was unfolding around it. And so I think it's very important to keep that in mind. So, in the Baroque period, the Church of England banned all stage productions during Lent. So during the holy period of Lent, you were not allowed to perform on stage or have these elaborate plays. So, oratorios, composers thought, provided a nice loophole. There was no acting going on. They had sacred subjects. They were about things from the Bible. And they had no special scenery or costumes. However, they did tell through singing and through music these religious stories. And so because they were religious and because they were telling these stories, it was kind of a way you could do these like staged performances. It's like opera that we'll talk about later, except no acting, no costumes, no set. Just imagine if people were standing on the stage and singing the songs as characters. So sometimes a singer might personify a certain biblical character, but again, it was very stripped down. The Messiah, written by Handel, he wrote it in just 24 days. It's probably one of the most famous oratorios ever. I like to think of oratorios, as I mentioned earlier, as like religious and very stripped down opera. So the Messiah is there. You can listen to it if you want. It's like 2.5 hours long which is crazy, thinking that he wrote a 2.5 hour long piece of music that's still one of the most popular pieces of music in the world in less than a month. That's very fast, considering. So anyways, I think that's interesting. The oratorio, again, you can kind of think of it as this religious opera, but very stripped down in what it entailed. Then, when we come to opera, we have to know the opera started in northern Italy around 1563, and it very quickly replaced the madrigal, which we learned about in the last time period, as kind of the preeminent form of vocal entertainment. According to your book, opera started as an effort to revitalize Greek drama, so supposedly there were these academics, this group of academics who gathered around and they thought, well, we really need to revitalize Greek thought and take these Greek stories and make them appealing to a modern audience, right? And so the way they decided to do that was through opera. And so they were telling these old stories that were told by the Greeks. We now understand that the Greeks had their own very sophisticated form of musical theater during this time, but they dusted it off and trotted it out for a new audience. Opera in the Baroque era had secular subjects. It had overtures and arias, recitatives, librettos, solos, and chorus. So it's very similar to what we have now. And opera used a combination of interesting music, dancing, and dramatic staging to highlight important words in the libretto. The libretto is like the text. So the composer writes the music and sets the text, and then the person who wrote the libretto provides all of the words. And this helped to capture the imagination of the audiences. Let's see, I think, so Peri, Jacopo Peri, wrote the first, what we think of as the first operas. Daphne was the first one, but it was lost. We have record that it was written and it was performed, but we don't have the music anymore. It's been lost to time. But Eurydice, written in the 1600s, is the oldest piece of opera that we still have musical material for. I've included a video of L'Orfeo by Monteverdi, composed in 1607, so just a few years later. I think it's one of my more favorite operas from this time. And if I'm not mistaken, this video is an entire performance that you can check out, with, if I'm not mistaken, period instruments. Yeah, I can see a theorbo and some viols, it looks like, in this orchestra pit. So that's a great opportunity, again, if you're looking for something to listen to. So opera had an effect on the orchestra. We can see here that the instruments that we have today are the result of a long evolution of instruments and of musical thought and of instrument building. So opera comes along, and rather than having our madrigals or our courtly music that might have only been performed in the Renaissance period for a small group, 50 or less people who could sit in a parlor together. Now all of a sudden we're performing for larger halls, opera halls, larger situations, and so our instruments need the ability to project more. The music they're playing is becoming more complicated, and so you need an instrument that is more agile. And so I thought that the viol da gamba and the theorbo were interesting examples of some musical kind of experimentation and evolution during this time, so you can check those out. The cantata and the castrati. These don't necessarily have, they don't relate exactly, although castratis most likely did sing cantatas. Cantatas are vocal pieces that were developed in the Baroque era. They can be sacred or secular and are sometimes described as small oratorios. So basically, if you are writing an oratorio, but it's going to be very short, or it's a small story or an isolated tale from the Bible or something that you're going to write about, then you could write it as a cantata instead. They include a mix of soloist, chorus, and various instruments. The castrato according to your book. I'll quote the, because it's kind of a sensitive subject, but I'll quote what your book had to say, is castrato is a surgically altered male. I think that's an interesting way to put it, who sang high-pitched vocal parts in operas. Opera producers arranged for young boys to be castrated before their voices changed. Primarily, this was the result of women not being allowed on stage in many places. And the castrato, according to your book again, was treated supposedly like a hero. The last castrati, I actually have a video here. Alessandro Moreschi, or Moreschi, sorry, I have so many names to memorize, who died in 1922. And this is a kind of interesting video you can listen of him singing the Crucifixus by Rossini in 1902. Of course, you have to keep in mind that this was recorded on most likely a phonograph, and so the audio quality is not incredible, but at least it gives you some sort of idea. I think the idea with the castrati was that basically by castrating the young boy, their bodies would continue to grow into the body of a man, but their development would be stunted, and because of that, their voices would not change in the same way, and so they would keep this very high-pitched, pure sound of a young boy who is singing, but it would be able to resonate in the chest cavity of a fully grown man. And so in a different world of the 1600s where women do not have all the same rights as men, and they are not allowed to perform on stage, you need someone to sing and to fill in the high harmonies. And so this is, unfortunately, the way that people of that time chose to do that. I also included a nice cantata by Bach, which you can check out. I put that this piece is an excellent example of the contrast that was embraced during this period. So you kind of hear times in this piece of music where Wir danken dir Gott, Wir danken dir is what the piece is called. You hear some examples of instrumental soloist and vocal soloists, sometimes kind of weaving these melodies in between the two, and that contrast between when the soloists are playing and then when the orchestra is playing. And it is really interesting and nice how Bach chooses to have these two, kind of a mini orchestra and then a full orchestra, and it can form these really intimate moments in the music when he brings it all into the smaller group of instruments. The concerto. So there are two types of concerto, the solo concerto and the concerto grosso. Both types of concertos are instrumental pieces, and they have three sections, and this is what defines something being a concerto. So it's 4 instruments. There are 3 distinct sections. The first section is a fast section, the second section is a slow contemplative section, and the third section, again, we end with a bang on a nice fast section. Sometimes there are more than 3 movements, but one of the other ideas with the concerto is this idea of contrast. So there's an idea of contrast either between, with the solo concerto, a solo instrument and a larger group, or with the concerto grosso, there's often a smaller orchestra or smaller group of instruments that will play certain parts, and then the larger group or the larger orchestra will come in to kind of emphasize what they just played or the important parts. And so there's a interplay between the smaller orchestra and the larger one, similar to what we would have heard in the Bach cantata from the last slide. Vivaldi's Four Seasons is a well-known type of concerto. Winter is one of my favorite movements, although Spring is probably the one that most people are familiar with. But I think Winter is really lovely. And so this group, this YouTube channel, they do at least what seems to be somewhat accurate and appropriate period productions of the music. So they use period instruments or instruments styled from the period of the Baroque. This would mean using cat gut or some sort of gut string on the stringed instruments. The bows are also very different. You'll notice that they kind of curve differently and they're held differently. And so this can give you a better idea of what the music would have sounded like at the time. The fugue is an instrumental composition that contains a subject or a melody, imitation, counterpoint, and polyphonic texture. After the subject is introduced by one part, it is successively taken up by the other parts and developed by interweaving still more parts. A highly technical and mesmerizing form of composition, it can be regarded as the most fully developed procedure of imitative counterpoint. There are three big sections of a fugue. So we have the exposition. In the exposition, at the beginning of the piece, we hear the subject for the first time, and then slowly, after the first part plays the subject, the second voice or the second instrument will come in also playing the subject. The third part will come in playing the subject, and the fourth part. It's almost like a round, if you've ever heard someone sing a round, where someone will go, row, row, row your boat, and then a measure or two later, while they continue, the first person continues with the song, the next person will come in and start, row, row, row your boat, and then the third person a measure or two later. Except that after a part is done with the subject or with the main melody, they typically play something, some piece of music that supports the other parts in their playing of the subject. The development, in this section, the composer takes the main melody and alters it with new material. There are many ways that composers take subjects and kind of fiddle with them. So you can do a retrograde, where you play the subject backwards, so the last note becomes the first note, and so on. And you play all the notes backwards, but maybe with the same rhythm. Maybe you use the rhythm backwards as well. There's a retrograde inversion, where if your melody went da da da, now it goes da 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 da. So sorry. So instead of going up the scale, it goes down the scale instead. And so if I were to step up by a certain degree instead, in retrograde, inversion, I would step down. And then you can do retrograde inversion, so you can play it backwards and moving in the opposite direction. There's all sorts of ways that you can alter a subject and do different things to it. You can fiddle with the rhythm that it plays. There's many different ways. And so these new musical ideas, or kind of messing with the subject and doing different things to it, putting it through different procedures, these are called episodes. So the development sections, as the name suggests, is meant to further develop those original musical ideas. And then finally we have the recapitulation, which restates that main melody as we heard it from the beginning and finds some way to wrap the whole thing up. I think it's really great fun to kind of close your eyes and listen to a fugue and try to follow along from the first time that you hear the subject being introduced. I think it's fun to follow along and listen as you hear the subject introduced by the other instruments, and then kind of try to diagnose as the piece goes on how the composer has dealt with that original material and how they have decided to reintroduce it to the listener, and what unique processes they can put it through to keep that material interesting. That the video on top here, I welcome you to watch it. It's kind of, I think it's a it's a piece by Bach. I believe it's called A Little Fugue, and it's one of his more popular ones. It's very short, but he uses it in this video to kind of display to you how the fugue works, and he mentions what part is playing and kind of diagnose or analyzes the piece as it goes by. And then we have a Bach fugue in B flat after that. Bach was one of the kings of the fugue during this period. And speaking of the devil, here he is. Johann Sebastian Bach lived between 1685 and 1750. He's arguably the most celebrated Baroque composer, although there are others who are also very celebrated. Deeply religious man, he was admired by his contemporary primarily as an outstanding harpsichordist, organist, and expert on organ building. Bach is now regarded as one of the greatest composers in the Western canon. Bach composed instrumental and vocal music as well as instructive music for those learning the keyboard. A master of the fugue, some of his most well-loved compositions include the Brandenburg Concertos, the Well-Tempered Clavier, and the B minor Mass, amongst others. The story goes that Bach was a church organist and a church musician. He had many children, but after his death, he was largely forgotten. And it wasn't until the Romantic period when we have Mendelssohn coming around, 100 years later, 150 years later, and we all of a sudden, I guess actually about 100 years later, and we have the rediscovery of Bach and his music. And so Mendelssohn also began to write in a sort of neo-Baroque style, and revitalized Bach. And if not for Mendelssohn having rediscovered his music, Bach would have been largely forgotten about, which would be a shame because he's one of our most celebrated composers now. Here's all the key terms that you need to know. These come straight from your book, and I've altered some of the definitions slightly, and some great listening examples for you. So I tried to put a fairly large range in here, pieces for instruments, pieces for the voice, some suites, sonatas, concertos, and all sorts of stuff. So I hope that you enjoy listening to it. As always, if you have any questions, if you're having any trouble, please do not hesitate to email me at kyle.berry@hgtc.edu. All right, I hope you have a great evening.